Hello, my name is Robin Rancharan. I'm director of the Research Institute on Preventive Diplomacy in ASEAN. And welcome to this first series on security and conflict resolution issues in Asia Pacific and beyond. I am joined today by Dr. Balázs Santos, who is a fellow, research fellow of the RIPTA Institute. He's also lecturer on international relations at Webster University, Thailand, and he's the coordinator of Webster's Masters in International Relations. We are here to discuss Dr. Balázs's recent book on China and the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands dispute, escalation and de-escalation. We will discuss the findings of the book and its implications for conflict resolution, dispute resolution in the South China Sea between the ASEAN countries and China. Dr. Balázs, let's start with a brief introduction of yourself. Where are you from, your educational background, and how you got to this topic?
Well, I'm Hungarian. I'm being educated primarily in Malaysia and in the United Kingdom. And I chose the topic for my book because I specialize in China and territorial disputes in Asia in general.
I see. So how, I'm just curious, what brought you to this specific dispute?
Well, I started to work on the book. Well, my doctoral dissertation that the book is based on in around 2013, and in 2012 was the year when tensions flared up over the Senkaku Islands due to the Japanese government's decision to purchase 3 of the islands from their previous private owners.
Right.
So back then and today it was a topical issue for Asian security.
How did this particular dispute emerge? Can you give us a little bit of the background?
Well,
the historical background?
The historical background goes back to the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895, but the dispute was dormant for the majority of the 20th century. It re-emerged in the 1970s due to 2 primary reasons. One was the 1971 Okinawa Reversion Treaty between the US and Japan that transferred the islands back from under American administrative control to Japanese administrative control. And the other one was the 1968 UN survey that hypothesized about the presence of large natural resources surrounding the islands.
Right. Have you had a chance to examine the merits of the arguments on both sides?
Well, both countries present their own legal arguments, and they are both flawed in unique ways. Japan's argument is based on the idea that they have incorporated the islands independently from the 1985 Sino-Japanese War, but the circumstances surrounding the incorporations of the islands is unusual, since they have incorporated it through cabinet decision rather than more established ways such as the placing of navigational markers or measures that would be of higher public notoriety. On the other hand, China claims to sustain sovereignty over the islands for a long historical time, but by the time we reach the late Qing dynasty and the Chinese Republic, that possession is tenuous at best and reliant on fairly old documentary sources and indirect mentions of the islands.
Indirect mentions?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
They essentially point to maps that colored the islands similar to China. These are mostly foreign maps that would attribute no particular significance to the Senkaku Islands, and to some Chinese administrative documents that tend to lump the islands in, or assume to lump the islands in with Taiwan.
So this starts to resemble a little bit the South China Sea dispute in terms of China's claim to historical possession.
Well, the root of the problem is the same on the South China Sea and on the East China Sea. The fact that traditionally none of these islands or reef hold any strategic or economic value to any countries in the region, and their significance has only been re-examined in the 1970s as China's security and economic interests have grown, and the other countries also became interested in potential natural resources in the area that were neither discovered nor exploitable for the most of the history of these countries.
So, if I understand, you've approached the topic from, as you say in the book, from a policy perspective. And so, tell us briefly what you mean by that, or why you adopted that approach.
Well, one of the things that characterized the academic literature when I was conducting my research, that most of them had specific recommendations on how the dispute to be resolved. But these recommendations were not grounded in a critical examination of policy possibilities, but rather theoretical or ideological assumptions. There was a lot of suggestions talking about how the dispute should be resolved, either through the international courts or to bilateral negotiations, without examining whether the parties would be willing to subject themselves to the proceedings and whether these proceedings could bear any fruits at the end of the process. Bilateral negotiations is often a suggested solution to the dispute, but it is a very flawed approach in the sense that Japan does not recognize the dispute. So right. Japan would immediately not be interested in negotiations. And ultimately negotiations would be also difficult because the question is of sovereignty, which is an indivisible force that neither country can compromise on. So I adopted the policy approach to see what is realistically possible within the dispute from an actual critical perspective, rather than basing it on theoretical assumptions with no critical engagement.
Following from that, what would you say are the main lines of argumentation of the two sides? What are do they have the same imperatives in claiming these group of islands?
You mean China and Japan?
China and Japan, yes.
Well, from a Japanese perspective, it's a question of historical possession. Japan has possessed the islands since 1895. From a Japanese perspective, there is limited security importance because the Ryukyu Islands and several other islands in the region offer much higher security potential compared to uninhabited barren reefs. So from a Japanese perspective, it's primarily a question of national sovereignty and potential economic resources, including fishing rights. From a Chinese perspective, the economic perspective is definitely an important one, but it's also a question of national politics, as the islands have significant symbolic meaning for the Chinese patriotic narrative that underpins much of China's contemporary identity. And it's also an issue of security, that in the absence of a navy comparable to many of the other major powers in the region, China continues to rely on the positioning of ground forces in strategic reefs and islands to maintain its maritime defenses.
Right. I'm curious, from a perspective of conflict resolution or even conflict prevention, do you think either side will be prepared to not only negotiate but compromise, or are the stakes too high for both actors? And part of the follow-on question would be, to what extent is nationalism driving on the conflict on both sides?
Well, I don't think either party is ready or willing to compromise. Nationalism, I wouldn't say it's directly driving the conflict itself. It's more of an expression of the nationalist dynamics between China and Japan in a larger context. That China's identity from a nationalist perspective is very much based on reclaiming its regional role. And in that narrative, Japan occupies a position of primary antagonist. On the other side, we see that Japan has traditionally not been very nationalistic after World War II, but under successive, more conservative governments, we see a certain nationalist revival. And under Shinzo Abe, Japan is redefining its security role.
Right.
And its conflict with China over the Senkaku Islands is a primary justification for why Japan should pursue a more active role in regional security.
Well, given the economic dimensions of the conflict, I think especially in the part of China, as you mentioned, have they ever discussed or talked about discussing something along the lines of the code of conduct, similarly to the discussion about the South China Sea?
There isn't a specific code of conduct. China and Japan has engaged in negotiations on setting up crisis hotlines to mitigate emerging conflicts, and there are discussions on how to cooperate activities in the region better. But in every cycle of escalation, these are the first ones that are frozen out.
Right.
And once the conflict thaws out a bit, they return to the negotiations, but none of these have been very successful so far. China has suspended, on occasion, the direct line with Japan.
Yes,
as a retaliation for what they perceive as provocative Japanese actions in the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe the final question, since we just mentioned Southeast Asia, South China Sea, what lessons can we learn from this dispute that could be applied to the South China Sea dispute, which involves even more parties? From the perspective again of resolving this conflict. I mean, one possible resolution is that they have an outright war.
Well, that would be rather unfortunate.
Yeah, of course. Involved. Yeah.
Now, in the short term, I think we have to recognize that peaceful conflict resolution options are of limited utility, because bilateral negotiations or third-party non-binding options or even binding international legal options are not going to be utilized. China is not interested in any of these approaches. And this is especially so on the South China Sea, where the power dynamics are much more in favor of China than it is between China and Japan. Now, in the long run, adopting a more constructivist approach, it is possible to redefine the dispute in a way that leads to a more favorable outcome, but that would be a long-term project of confidence building and seeking engagement with China. In the immediate short term, the only lesson ASEAN can take from Japan is the importance of deterrence and essentially examining critically China's strategic calculations and understanding where are the points where influence can be applied to deter the outbreak of a military conflict. And to that, with the absence of a possibility of a diplomatic resolution, that leaves very little for either Japan or ASEAN other than seeking deterrence that could force essentially a delaying stalemate to the dispute. Since China is not only interested in economic resources, which could be resolved through joint development, but security and sovereignty, and there's also a significant political component attached, there isn't really a compromise that would be acceptable to the Chinese short of gaining possessions of the islands and then allowing other countries to jointly develop the economic resources. So unless ASEAN or Japan would be willing to accept a loss of administrative control over these territories, then there is really no compromise to have.
Right.
And in that case, the only thing that can prevent a conflict is deterrence by altering China's calculations, by raising the costs of coercive military action, and by that trying to make a diplomatic outcome more attractive.
Right. So, last thought on this, that implies while engaging in confidence building and the code of conduct and so on, but it does also imply serious arms buildups.
Well, it sounds counterintuitive for most people that we can negotiate and arm ourselves at the same time. But we have to distinguish between short-term possibilities and long-term objectives. And it's not even necessarily large-term military build-up for ASEAN that is the primary question to have, because China's maritime power projection capabilities remain limited compared to the overall size of the People's Liberation Army. For ASEAN, the primary question is bridging the differences between the maritime ASEAN states and the continental ASEAN states, because ASEAN needs to present a unified front on where they stand on the South China Sea, even though the South China Sea is not an interest to several of the ASEAN states,
right,
which can impact ASEAN decision making due to the consensual nature of the organization. So I would say that in the immediate terms, countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, it's not necessarily a question of building up arms, rather than reinforcing their alliances with countries like Cambodia and Thailand and Singapore, who are not immediately interested in the dispute and see more value in accommodating China to gain economic benefits,
right, yes, yeah,
potentially at the expense of the territorial interests of other ASEAN countries.
right. Well, I'm afraid that will be the last word. Thank you, Dr. Balash, for joining us and for talking about your new book, recent book, China and the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands Dispute. We will have more of these conversations, so please look out on our website, ripda.webster.ac.th. Please look out for more such videos in the months to come. Thank you very much, and see you next time.